At 2:00 a.m., I found my digital signature attached to a $14 million crypto fraud targeting vulnerable retirees, cooked up right beneath my feet. They thought an old man would panic. They thought wrong. I'm David Vance, a 9-year-old, retired Chief Information Security Officer from Redmond, Washington. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled them, please subscribe. Also tell me in the comments what country are you listening from, and what would you do in my shoes. The rain in Redmond doesn't fall so much as it hangs in the air. A cold, persistent drizzle that coats the tall Douglas firs and turns the gravel driveway into a soft slick of gray stone. 6 months ago, on the day we buried Sarah, that drizzle felt like the only constant left in my world. Sarah and I had spent 38 years in this custom-built craftsman home on the edge of town. We had built a life grounded in quiet, predictable routines, a fresh pot of dark roast at 6 in the morning, the needle dropping on a Miles Davis vinyl in the evening, and the steady, reassuring rustle of the wind through the pines outside our bedroom window. When cancer took her in early November, the house suddenly felt vast and hollow, its silence heavy enough to press the air straight out of your lungs. Then came Mark Reed. Mark was Sarah's half-brother, nearly 30 years, her junior, the product of a late, impulsive marriage by her father. I had met him only 3 times over the course of 2 decades, usually at chaotic family gatherings, where he would corner anyone standing still to ramble about his latest groundbreaking investment opportunity. He was 38, but carried himself with the unearned swagger of a teenager who had just discovered designer knockoffs and hair pomade. 3 days after Sarah's memorial service, Mark showed up on my front porch. He was holding a single worn duffel bag, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled off a soaked leather jacket. "David," he had sobbed, his voice raspy and choked with practiced desperation. I didn't know where else to turn. The crypto market collapsed. My business partners locked me out of the company. I lost the apartment in Seattle. Sarah always told me if things got dark, family was family. I stood in the doorway, the cool, damp air pooling around my ankles. I knew Mark was a grifter. I had spent 35 years as a chief information security officer for top-tier defense contractors, reading people, assessing threat vectors, and identifying structural anomalies were not just skills I left at the office, they were how my mind was hardwired. I saw right through the performance, but Sarah had loved him with the forgiving patience of an older sister, and her memory was still so raw, so tender, that I couldn't bring myself to turn him away into the November storm. "There's room in the basement," I told him quietly, stepping aside. "The daylight suite. It's furnished. Go get warm." That was my mistake. Not because I showed mercy, but because I assumed Mark possessed at least a baseline of human decency. Within 2 weeks, the quiet rhythm of my home was obliterated. The basement suite, once a serene daylight-filled sanctuary, where Sarah kept her painting easel, was transformed into a noisy subterranean command center. Mark brought in crates of custom computer rigs, high-end server racks, and noisy liquid cooling units. Lugging them down the stairs in the middle of the night, the low, rhythmic hum of industrial cooling fans began to vibrate through the hardwood floorboards of my living room, a constant 6-0 cycle buzz that rattled the fine china in the kitchen cabinets. Mark didn't offer a single dollar toward the utilities, nor did he offer a word of genuine gratitude. Instead, he treated my house like a free boutique hotel where the manager happened to be an annoyance. Every morning at 6:30, I would sit at the kitchen island with my black coffee, reading the physical edition of the Wall Street Journal. Mark would stumble up the basement stairs around noon, wearing silk pajamas, his phone glued to his ear as he barked slang into the microphone. "Yeah, bro, we're pumping the liquidity pool at midnight." No, the Mark won't notice. We wrap it in a cold wallet and dump. Whenever he noticed me sitting there, a smirk would creep across his face, that particular, arrogant curl of the lip, reserved for people who genuinely believe they are the smartest operators in every room they enter. "Morning, old man," he'd say, pouring himself a mug of my coffee without asking, leaving the glass pot completely empty. "Still reading news on dead trees? Huh. You know, if you spent less time with the paper, and let me manage your pension. You wouldn't have to live off leftover defense dollars. Crypto is code, David. Real code. Not whatever prehistoric mainframe stuff you used to punch into cards back in the 1980s. I would look up over the top of my reading glasses, take a slow sip of coffee, and set the mug back on the coaster without making a sound. Software changes. Mark, I replied once, keeping my tone entirely neutral. Human nature doesn't. Systems built on greed usually have built-in single points of failure. He laughed aloud, condescending bark that echoed off the high ceilings. Right. Whatever you say. Fossil. Just keep the Wi-Fi on. I never argued with him. I never raised my voice. In my line of work, the loud guys, the ones who bragged about their access credentials and boasted about their exploits in public forums, were always the first ones to get burned. The truly dangerous minds never made noise. They sat quietly in the background, monitored the traffic, and waited for the target to commit a fatal operational error. For 4 months, I endured it. I paid the utility bills, which spiked from $200 a month to over $4,000. I cleaned up his discarded takeout containers from the quartz counters. I swallowed my anger when he invited his loud, chain-smoking cronies over at midnight to celebrate bull market runs. I tolerated it all because of my promise to Sarah. Until tonight. It began at 1:45 a.m. I was in my study on the main floor, unable to sleep. My routine on restless nights was simple: a glass of neat bourbon, a disc lamp, and a mechanical pencil to work through classical chess problems in a leather notebook. Suddenly, my personal laptop connected to my private, air-gapped network monitor triggered a soft, high-pitched chime. It was a custom diagnostic tool I had written myself 20 years ago and kept updated out of sheer muscle memory. It monitored bandwidth allocation, IP routing, and hardware handshakes across my home gateway. The screen blinked red. A sudden, massive spike in outgoing encrypted data was choking my residential fiber connection. Millions of encrypted packets were flooding out from an internal IP address, the server array down in the basement. Out of curiosity, I opened a terminal window. I didn't need to break into Mark's physical hardware. He was routing his entire setup through my home gateway router. The router he assumed was just a generic box provided by the local internet provider. He didn't know I had replaced the stock firmware with a custom enterprise-grade kernel years ago. To Mark, I was just a retired senior who barely knew how to clear a browser history. I started tracing the packets. Within 10 minutes, the picture became crystal clear. Mark wasn't just mining crypto or trading tokens. He was hosting a fraudulent, highly sophisticated phishing mirror designed to target elderly citizens, specifically military veterans, and retired federal employees, promising them guaranteed high-yield treasury bond conversions into private crypto tokens. He was robbing people who were my age, people who had worked 40 years to build a modest nest egg, taking advantage of their lack of digital literacy to drain their lifetime savings into an untraceable offshore pool. My jaw tightened. My heart rate didn't spike. Instead, my core temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Cold surgical clarity settled over me. Then I pulled up the root configuration files of his routing protocol. My breath caught in my throat. Mark hadn't just used my internet connection. To protect himself when the federal authorities inevitably caught up to the scheme, he had forged my digital signature, attached my social security number, and assigned my primary personal device as the administrative master key for the entire fraudulent domain. Underneath the hood of his illegal network lay a hidden directory labeled Fall Guy Docs. Inside were fabricated emails, spoofed identity verification logs, and altered bank records, all meticulously designed to make it look as though I, David Vance, retired cybersecurity chief, was the mastermind behind the multi-million-dollar heist, and Mark was merely an unwitting tenant living downstairs. He was going to steal $14 million from innocent retirees, walk away clean, and leave me to spend the rest of my natural life behind bars in a federal penitentiary. From directly beneath my floorboards, I heard the muffled sound of a champagne cork popping, followed by Mark's loud, triumphant laughter and the clinking of glasses. To the future, boys, Mark shouted from the basement. Let the old man take the heat while we hit the beach. I closed my laptop lid softly. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out into the dark Redmond rain. I didn't scream. I didn't grab a baseball bat and storm down the basement stairs. I didn't confront him. Confrontation is for amateur. In the world of high-level network warfare, when an adversary exposes their flank, you don't give them a warning. You deploy the payload. I opened my desk drawer, pulled out a small, steel-cased hardware key that hadn't seen the light of day in 5 years, and plugged it into my laptop port. It was time to show my guests down the hall what happens when you attempt to frame a ghost. The daylight suite beneath my living room had once been Sarah's sanctuary. It had tall, double-pane windows that looked out over the back acre, where Douglas firs towered like ancient sentinels against the Pacific Northwest sky. Sarah used to sit down there for hours with her watercolors, capturing the muted greens and slate grays of rainy Washington afternoons. It was a space defined by soft, natural light, the smell of turpentine and cedar, and a deep, restorative quiet. Within 3 weeks of Mark's arrival, that sanctuary was erased. It began with the deliveries. Freight trucks from Seattle and Tacoma started pulling up my gravel driveway at odd hours, 8 in the morning, 10 at night. Once at 2 in the morning, men in unmarked vans unloaded heavy wooden crates and stacked cardboard boxes stamped with foreign shipping labels. Mark didn't carry them down himself. He hired gig workers from an app, barking orders at them from the porch while sipping energy drinks in his bathrobe. Watch the corners, pal. That's 10 grand of processing power in that box. You drop it. You pay for it. I watched from the kitchen window, my mug of dark roast resting in my hands. I didn't say a word. In my 35 years managing network infrastructure for federal defense contractors, I had seen millions of dollars in hardware moved into subterranean server farms. I recognized the rectangular silhouettes of high-density server chassis, industrial power distribution units, PDUs, and heavy-duty liquid cooling radiators. Mark wasn't just setting up a laptop to trade crypto. He was constructing a miniature data center beneath my feet. By the second month, the character of the house had fundamentally changed. The quiet that Sarah and I had built over nearly 4 decades was replaced by a persistent, low-frequency hum, a relentless 6-0 cycle vibration that rose up through the oak floorboards. It rattled the framed photographs on the hallway walls and sent microscopic ripples across the surface of my morning coffee. Then came the heat. High-density processing units generate immense thermal energy. Soon, the warm air pushed up through the floor vents, bringing with it the synthetic, metallic smell of hot circuit boards, thermal paste, and ozone. It drowned out the scent of pine and fresh rain that had filled the house for 30 years. Mark showed no awareness of the intrusion, or if he did, he viewed it as his birthright. He operated on a nocturnal clock, sleeping until noon and prowling the house during the afternoon, before locking himself in the basement all night. Every time he emerged, he treated the home like a roadside motel, where he was the only esteemed guest. He left greasy pizza boxes on the quartz kitchen counter, empty energy drink cans in the sink, and mud-caked designer sneakers by the front door. One Tuesday morning in late January, I was sitting at the dining table, working through a classical endgame scenario in my leather chess ledger. The morning light was crisp, cutting through the damp glass of the bay window. Mark wandered up the stairs, wearing an oversized silk robe with gold embroidery, his phone strapped to a hands-free headset. He poured himself a glass of orange juice directly from the carton, drank half of it, and set the container back in the refrigerator without putting the cap back on. He walked over to my table, leaned against the back of a hand-carved mahogany chair, and looked down at my chessboard, still playing with wooden toys. "David," he asked, a crooked, pitying smile touching his lips. "Man, I don't know how you survive. No action, no yield, just sitting here moving pieces of painted wood around like it's 1,850. I didn't look up immediately. I carefully noted down the algebraic notation for a rook maneuver in my notebook before capping my pen. Then I turned my eyes toward him. "Chess isn't about action, Mark," I said, my voice measured and low. "It's about spatial control, resource management, and anticipating consequences. 6 moves before your opponent realizes he's in a trap." Mark let out a sharp mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. Yeah, well, in the real world, speed beats strategy every single time. While you're sitting here contemplating your next move, I'm pulling down 5 figures a day in automated liquidity pools. The world moved on. David, the stuff you did back in the 90s firewalls, mainframe protocols. It's like knowing how to fix a horse-drawn carriage. Useful in a history museum, totally useless on the highway. He reached over, picked up a black knight from my board, flipped it in the air, and caught it. You should let me set you up with a digital wallet, he continued, tossing the knight casually back onto the board, knocking over 2 pawns in the process. Give me 50 grand from Sarah's life insurance payout. I'll double it in a month. Better than letting it rot in a low-interest savings account while inflation eats it alive. I looked at the knocked-over pawns, then back up at Mark's face. I didn't feel anger. Anger is an emotional noise that clouds analytical thinking. In my career, when a foreign threat actor attempted to penetrate a secure network, you didn't get angry at the intrusion. You analyzed the signature, mapped the topology, and calculated the precise moment to sever the uplink. My finances are well managed. Mark, I said softly, standing up to set the chess pieces back in their exact positions, and Sarah's legacy is not something I gamble with. Suit yourself. Fossil, he sneered, pulling his phone off his headset. Just trying to help you keep up. Oh, by the way, don't run the dishwasher and the dryer at the same time tonight. It trips the circuit breaker on my primary rig down there. And when my rig drops offline for even 10 seconds, I lose thousands in transaction fees. He turned and strolled back down the basement stairs, slamming the door behind him. I stood alone in the quiet dining room. I didn't yell. I didn't march down there to demand respect. Instead, I sat back down, picked up my mechanical pencil, and smoothed out the page of my notebook. Mark suffered from the classic arrogance of the modern operator. He mistook access for ownership and complexity for intelligence. He assumed that because he could run pre-written scripts and rent computing power, he understood the fundamental architecture of the system he was standing on. He didn't realize that the very foundation he built his empire upon was laid by engineers who understood every gate, every transistor, and every line of assembly code. 3 weeks later, the consequences of his arrogance arrived in the mail. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon in mid-February. I walked down to the mailbox at the end of the long driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. Among the local circulars and garden catalogs was a thick envelope from Puget Sound Energy, marked with a red urgency band. I opened it right there on the porch. My normal monthly electric bill for the property hovered around $220. The statement in my hands read, 4美元, 280, 40. Below the total was an automated usage graph showing a vertical spike. Starting the exact week, Mark had moved his server racks into the daylight suite. The utility company had added a formal notice. Unusually high continuous load detected. Residential transformer threshold near capacity. Before I could even step inside, my mobile phone vibrated in my pocket. It wasn't a call. It was a priority alert from my internet service provider. A direct notification sent to my registered primary administrative contact. I unlocked the screen and read the text. Alert. High-volume outbound telemetry detected on line connection 8841 WA. Traffic profile exhibits signatures consistent with unauthorized proxy routing and unverified high-frequency automated node activity. Continued pattern will result in immediate suspension of residential service and escalation to regional regulatory oversight. I held the phone in my hand, the wind whistling cold through the fir trees around the driveway. Mark hadn't just plugged in a few servers. He had converted my peaceful home into a high-risk, rogue network terminal. And he was using my identity, my address, and my utility grid as his human shield. I walked inside, closed the front door quietly, and set the utility bill on the entryway table. Dully, from beneath the floorboards, came the eternal, mechanical drone of the cooling fans. I didn't head down the stairs. Instead, I walked to my private study, locked the oak door from the inside, and opened my laptop. The time for patience was over. The study was cold. I left the desk lamp off, letting only the faint, Blue luminance of my dual monitor setup cast long shadows across the mahogany shelves and framed certificates lining the walls. Outside, the Washington rain continued its steady, relentless assault against the window pane, the wet pine branches scraping softly against the glass like restless fingers. I pulled my chair up to the desk, opened a raw Linux terminal, and took a slow breath. When you spend 35 years in high-level network forensics, you learn that digital footprints are like tracks in wet mud. A perpetrator can try to brush over them, they can wear different shoes, or they can walk backward. But if you know how to analyze the depth of the impression and the displacement of the soil, the truth is always there, waiting to be uncovered. Mark believed that because he had placed a flashy commercial firewall between his basement server racks and the outside world, he was invisible. He operated under the naive assumption that the residential router supplied by the telecommunications company was a dumb, transparent conduit. A simple pipe carrying light signals from his machines to the fiber optic line, buried beneath my driveway. He didn't know that 3 years ago, long before he ever darkened my doorstep, I had completely re-engineered my home network. I hadn't just plugged in the factory gateway. I had bypassed its stock operating system, flashed the firmware with a custom kernel. I compiled myself and routed every single micro-packet of incoming and outgoing data through a passive, tap-monitored hardware bridge embedded inside my desk. To anyone scanning from the outside or from the basement, it appeared as standard, unmanaged residential traffic. In reality, every bit, every byte, and every handshake passing through my house was being logged, mirrored, and indexed in real time on an air-gapped storage drive sitting right next to my knee. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a fraction of a second before falling into a familiar rhythmic cadence. Clack, clack, clack. TCP dump. I et 0. NNS 0. V-Not Port 22. The terminal screen came alive. Green and white text scrolled across the dark background in a blinding waterfall of data, IP addresses, port numbers, packet lengths, and hexadecimal headers cascaded down the display like digital rain. I paused the capture stream and applied a statistical bandwidth filter to isolate the heaviest traffic channels. Immediately, the system pointed toward a single local IP address, 192.1105. The primary interface for Mark's server array down in the daylight suite. It was consuming 94% of my total uplink bandwidth. I initiated a passive deep packet inspection, stripping away the outer transport layers to see where all those gigabytes were heading. The packets were routed through a dense, multi-layered mesh of onion-routed proxy servers, bouncing from intermediate nodes in Panama, Estonia, and the Seychelles before hitting their final destinations. To an untrained observer, tracing the origin of those data streams would seem impossible, a labyrinth of smoke and mirrors, designed to exhaust any legal or technical inquiry. But Mark had made a fundamental mistake, a classic, amateur error born of pure laziness. While he had encrypted the payload traffic traveling to his offshore command and control servers, he had left the local diagnostic logging protocols completely unencrypted on the internal gateway bridge. He assumed that because the traffic was contained within the four walls of my house, no one was listening. I opened an internal packet analyzer and reassembled the raw HTTP streams. What appeared on my screen made my stomach drop. It wasn't a crypto mining operation. It wasn't a speculative trading desk or an automated liquidity pool. Mark was running a massive, highly coordinated phishing and identity theft infrastructure. The primary target domain was an impeccably designed clone of the official U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Benefits portal. The interface was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, official-looking government seals, authoritative typography, and urgent banners warning elderly users that their pension accounts required immediate security upgrades to prevent a freeze on their monthly payouts. As I scrolled through the captured session logs, I watched the trap spring in real time. A 7-2-year-old retired Marine from Ohio had just logged into the spoofed portal. The system prompted him to enter his social security number, his banking credentials, and his home address. Once those were captured, The site seamlessly redirected him to a secondary portal that offered a guaranteed high-yield conversion program, promising to protect his life savings from inflation by transferring his funds into a private digital asset vault. It wasn't just automated theft. It was systematic predation. Mark was harvesting the life savings of men and women who had spent their youth serving their country, people who had spent decades laying brick, driving trucks, or working manufacturing lines to secure a modest retirement. He was draining their accounts to zero, transferring the proceeds into untraceable digital wallets, and leaving them with nothing but a blank screen and a broken promise. I sat in the dark, my hand resting motionless on the mouse. Over 35 years in corporate defense, I had seen state-sponsored cyber espionage, industrial theft, and multi-million-dollar ransomware campaigns. I had dealt with ruthless adversaries who operated with ice-cold mathematical precision, but there was something uniquely vile about the man sitting directly beneath my feet. Mark wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a coward with a high-speed internet connection, a parasitic sociopath who preyed on the vulnerable while sipping my coffee and mocking my age. A dark, heavy anger began to settle in my chest, not the hot, explosive rage that makes a man raise his voice or slam his fist on a table, but a cold, dense, granite-like resolve. I scrolled further down into the directory tree of the captured proxy bridge, following the administrative command logs. I needed to see how Mark was managing the payouts, where the stolen capital was being consolidated. That was when I discovered the secondary hidden directory embedded inside the local system mirror. It was named Fall. Guy. Docs. I clicked on the encrypted folder. Using the administrative master key generated by my custom gateway, the folder decrypted instantly. Inside were dozens of carefully prepared files, spoofed identity verification documents, altered lease agreements, and fraudulent digital signatures. Mark hadn't just set up his illegal operation in my house. He had meticulously constructed a digital paper trail designed to frame me for every single dollar stolen. The master administrative account controlling the fraudulent domain wasn't registered to Mark Reed. It was registered to David Vance. The recovery email was my personal address. The primary payout routing key was linked to a dormant digital wallet that had been generated using my private identity credentials data. Mark had undoubtedly stolen from Sarah's old filing cabinets in the attic while I was at her memorial service. If the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security raided this house tomorrow, every piece of forensic evidence on those servers would point directly to a retired 6-9-year-old chief information security officer who had the technical capability, the infrastructure, and the network access to pull off a multi-million-dollar heist. Mark had built himself an ironclad parachute, and he had designed it out of my life, my reputation, and my freedom. From directly beneath my floorboards, I heard the faint sound of laughter filtered through the floorboards. Mark was on a speakerphone call, his obnoxious, nasal voice carrying clearly through the central heating duct. "I'm telling you, man, the infrastructure is bulletproof," he chuckled, the sound of ice clinking against glass accompanying his words. "If the feds ever track the IP, they're going to find an old retired spook sitting on a mountain of digital evidence. By the time he figures out how to explain it to a judge, I'll be sitting on a terrace in Dubai sipping mojitos. The guy doesn't even know how to use a smartphone." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I looked at the terminal screen, where the stream of stolen veterans' pensions continued to scroll. Mark thought he was playing a game of speed. He thought youth, arrogance, and cheap trickery gave him an insurmountable edge over an old man who moved slowly and kept his mouth shut. He had forgotten the fundamental rule of network security. When you build an attack infrastructure inside someone else's house, you are not the predator. You are simply a guest operating inside a trap you don't understand. I minimized the capture window and opened a fresh text editor. My hands were completely steady. The cold anger in my chest had distilled into absolute, surgical focus. I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't need to call the police to come barging in with warrants that would take months to execute while Mark sanitized his drives. I was going to dismantle him from the inside out, bit by bit, line by line, until there was nothing left of his digital empire except the cold, hard walls of a federal prison cell I reached for my desk drawer, pulled out a small black USB key containing my personal archive of custom diagnostic tools, and plugged it into the master port. The game had officially begun. The rain outside intensified, drumming a steady, hollow rhythm against the window panes of my study. It was 2:00 a.m. The house was quiet except for the low, vibration-heavy hum rising from the basement, the sound of Mark's stolen fortunes processing through my residential power grid. I sat back in my leather desk chair, staring at the dark screen of my secondary monitor. In my line of work, panic is a fatal flaw. When a critical breach occurs, the amateur reacts with noise, anger, and hasty moves that alert the adversary. The professional, however, slows everything down. You observe the environment, map every dependency, and identify the single point of failure that will collapse the entire structure without leaving a footprint. I reached for my desk drawer, pulled out a brushed steel USB hardware key, and inserted it into my laptop port. This key held my private software archive, a repository of custom-built system utilities, legacy network diagnostic scripts, and zero-day vulnerability proofs of concept I had authored over a 35-year career. Among them was a proprietary network memory allocation exploit I had discovered 15 years ago while auditing core operating system kernels for defense infrastructure. It was an elegant, silent mechanism, a flaw that allowed an administrator with localized hardware access to inject custom instructions directly into an active memory stack without triggering security logs or alerting automated intrusion detection systems. I opened a raw text editor. My hands were calm, moving across the keys with the steady, unhurried cadence of a musician playing a familiar piece. I began drafting the payload. I wasn't writing a conventional virus or ransomware. I had no interest in locking Mark's screens or sending him a ransom note. Brute force is for amateur. What I was constructing was an automated execution protocol, a logic routine that would turn Mark's own infrastructure against him. The payload was designed to do two things with absolute surgical precision. First, it would hook directly into the administrative routing process of Mark's primary server at precisely 3:00 am. The routine would quietly override the payout destination keys for his fraudulent crypto pool. Every dollar of stolen funds sitting in his intermediate holding wallets, as well as the $14 million he planned to siphon off in his final exit scam, would be instantly rerouted through an untraceable multi-sig smart contract designed to disperse the capital into verified, anonymized donation wallets for the Global Pediatric Cancer Fund and the National Veterans Assistance Foundation. Second, the script would execute a complete forensic dump of Mark's local hardware. It would extract his unencrypted session keys, keyboard biometric logs, MAC address histories, and hardware serial numbers. It would bundle these proofs alongside the raw PCAP network captures detailing his phishing portal operations, seal the package with an immutable digital timestamp, and transmit it directly to the automated intake gateway of the FBI Cybercrime Division in Seattle. And most importantly, the script would scrub the fabricated Fall Guy docs folder from my network gateway, permanently erasing every trace of the digital breadcrumbs Mark had planted to frame me. As I typed out the final lines of the control loop, heavy footsteps echoed on the basement stairs. The door at the end of the hallway swung open. Mark stepped out into the corridor, holding a glass of scotch in one hand and his phone in the other. He was dressed in a designer leather jacket, his hair slicked back, a broad, triumphant grin plastered across his face. He didn't notice the dark study at first. He walked toward the kitchen, whistling a tune. Before stopping in front of my open doorway, he leaned against the doorframe, taking a slow sip of his drink. Still awake? "Old man?" Mark asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "You look like you're writing your will over there." I didn't close my laptop. I didn't rush to hide the screen. I simply rested my hands on the edge of the desk and looked up at him through the dim light of the desk lamp. "Just finishing up some paperwork, Mark," I said quietly. Mark chuckled. A short, arrogant bark. He walked into the room, stepping onto the Persian rug with his mud-caked boots. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, and tossed it casually onto my desk. The bills fanned out across my leather blotter, landing right beside my chess notebook. There's $2,000, Mark said, leaning over the desk and pressing his palms against the wood. Consider it compensation for the electric bill and the hospitality. Because in 48 hours, I'm out of here. Got a one-way ticket to first class. Taking a little permanent vacation down south. I looked down at the money on my desk, then back up into his eyes. A permanent vacation. That's right, he sneered, tapping his temple with his forefinger. While you were sitting here playing with your wooden chess pieces and reading Dead Tree newspapers, I built a machine, a $14 million machine. You see, David, guys like you spent your whole lives following rules, working 40 years for a pension, waiting for permission to live. Guys like me, we take what we want, and we leave the slow movers holding the bag. He straightened up, taking another swallow of his scotch, his eyes gleaming with the hollow euphoria of someone who believed he had outsmarted the universe. You should thank me, Mark added with a cruel smirk. I gave this boring old house a purpose for 6 months. Keep the change, David. Buy yourself a nice new radio or something. I listened to him without moving a muscle. My pulse remained steady at 60 beats a minute. I felt no urge to argue, no desire to tell him what was sitting on the terminal screen 3 inches from his elbow. In that moment, looking at his smug, self-satisfied face, I realized something profound. The most dangerous trap a man can fall into is his own unearned arrogance. He was so blinded by his contempt for my age and my quietness that he couldn't see he was standing in the kill zone of a setup he lacked the capability to comprehend. Safe travels, Mark, I said, my voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. Make sure you enjoy every second of the time you have left. Mark laughed, shaking his head as he backed out of the room. Yeah, whatever you say. Pop, try not to miss me too much. He turned and strolled down the hallway, the sound of his heavy boots fading as he descended back into the basement. A moment later, the heavy door clicked shut, and the muffled vibration of the cooling fans resumed its steady hum. I turned back to my laptop. I moved the cursor over the terminal window. The code was compiled. The target parameters were locked. The memory injection vector was primed and waiting for execution. I looked at the clock in the bottom corner of my screen. It read 2:42 a.m. I placed my index finger over the enter key. To Sarah, I whispered into the quiet room. I pressed the key. The screen flickered once as the terminal executed the command. A single, silent line of text appeared at the bottom of the black screen. Plus, payload deployed successfully. Target process hooked. Automated execution set for 03:0000 UTC. I closed the laptop lid. I picked up the stack of $100 bills Mark had thrown onto my desk, walked over to the fireplace, and set them neatly on the mantelpiece. Then I sat down in my armchair, poured myself a small glass of neat bourbon, and waited for 3 o'clock to arrive. The grandfather clock in the dining room struck 3. Its heavy, brass pendulum swung back and forth behind the etched glass, marking the arrival of the hour, with 3 slow, resonant chimes that faded into the quiet house. In my study, the secondary monitor remained dark, but on the main terminal screen, a quiet transformation was taking place. The execution loop had triggered precisely on the second. Across the bottom of the black screen, green text scrolled with the rhythmic, unhurried precision of an automated machine. The zero-day memory injection had successfully hooked into Mark's primary gateway server without firing a single warning event on his local dashboard. To his active administrative interface, the system appeared completely normal, displaying its usual synthetic metrics of high-volume traffic and steady bandwidth consumption. Underneath that surface, however, the digital architecture was being systematically dismantled. The payload's first directive engaged the holding protocols of the offshore crypto scam. Within the span of 45 seconds, the script executed 11,000 microtransactions, intercepting the stolen capital sitting in Mark's intermediate staging wallets. Line by line, balance by balance, $14 million were rerouted through an untraceable, immutable smart contract interface. The funds were instantly distributed into verified, anonymized endowment accounts for the Global Pediatric Cancer Fund and the National Veterans Assistance Foundation. The capital didn't linger in any centralized server where a lawyer or an offshore broker could freeze it. It simply ceased to exist on Mark's ledgers. dispersing like morning fog over Puget Sound, returning in digital equivalents to the purpose of healing and restoration. At 3:12 a.m., the second phase of the script executed. The diagnostic routine initiated a full, uncompressed forensic dump of the basement server array. Every session token, every raw network packet capture, every keystroke log, and every piece of hardware telemetry was compiled into an encrypted archive. Embedded within the headers of this file was the indisputable cryptographic proof, the hardware MAC addresses belonging directly to Mark's physical machines, time-stamped with atomic accuracy, showing that every single phishing attempt, forged signature, and stolen identity had originated from his personal terminal. The script automatically transmitted the forensic package directly to the secure intake portal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrime Division in Seattle. Attached to the transmission was an automated priority alert, flagged with the highest threat severity matrix. And then, with one final silence commun, the script executed a deep-level sanitization of my home gateway, the fabricated fall, guy, docs folder, the entire digital frame job Mark had spent 4 months meticulously planting to ruin my life, was overwritten with random binary noise 7 times over before its index entries were permanently purged from the system table. My network was clean. My name was cleared. I clicked the terminal closed, powered down the laptop, and removed the hardware key from the port. I placed the key back in my desk drawer, locked it, and put the small brass key into my pocket. From directly beneath my feet came the first sound of structural collapse. It didn't begin with a shouting match or a confrontation. It began with the sudden, harsh screech of an industrial cooling fan, stalling out as power routing commands failed. A heavy thump echoed through the floorboards, the sound of an office chair being pushed back so violently that it slammed into a drywall panel. What the hell? Mark's voice rose up through the floor vent, high-pitched, strained, and stripped of all its slick, arrogant cadence. I heard the rapid, desperate clatter of mechanical keys being slammed in chaotic sequence. Clack, 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 clack. No load. Reload. You piece of garbage. I stood up from my leather chair, walked out of the study, and moved unhurriedly into the kitchen. The rain had softened to a light, misty spray against the window, the black branches of the fir trees outside, motionless in the windless night. I filled the glass carafe of my coffee maker with cold filtered water, measured out 3 scoops of dark roast grounds into the paper filter, and flipped the switch. The machine hummed softly, beginning to drip. Down in the basement, the chaos escalated. Heavy footsteps paced back and forth across the concrete floor below. Doors slammed. Metal chassis rattled as Mark frantically ripped cables out of ports, trying in vain to figure out why his administrative master key had been revoked, why his wallets displayed a 0 balance, and why every external command interface returned a terminal error. Access denied. System reconfigured. David. The basement door at the end of the hallway crashed open against the wall. Mark stood in the doorway, panting heavily, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. His designer jacket was half unzipped, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute terror. He had his phone in one trembling hand, the screen flashing red with system failure notifications. David, something's wrong with the net, he screamed, his voice cracking as he stumbled down the hallway toward the kitchen. My whole array just dumped. The wallets, $14 million. David, it's gone. All of it. The system got hit by a wipe vector. Did you touch something? Did you mess with the main router line? I didn't turn around immediately. I picked up a ceramic mug from the cupboard, set it on the counter, and watched the dark coffee fill the pot. When I finally turned to face him, I rested my hands calmly against the edge of the quartz countertop. I told you earlier, Mark, I said, my voice low, quiet, and completely devoid of emotion. Systems built on greed always have single points of failure. Mark stared at me, his chest heaving, his mouth slightly open. For a second, a flicker of terrifying realization crossed his face, a sudden, creeping awareness that the quiet, 6'9" old man standing in front of him wasn't an oblivious relic of the past. You, Mark whispered, his fingers tightening around his phone. until his knuckles turned white. You did this. How you don't even have access to my servers. You don't have my encryption keys. You brought your hardware into my house. Mark replied softly, meeting his gaze with unblinking clarity. You connected your servers to my network bridge. You used my name, my identity, and my deceased wife's memory to shield yourself while you robbed helpless veterans of their life savings. You thought, because I didn't raise my voice or make noise, I was helpless. I stepped forward, taking one slow step toward him. Mark involuntarily took a step back, hitting his shoulder against the doorframe. You don't know anything about network architecture. Mark, I continued calmly. You know how to run scripts. Other people wrote. You know how to talk loudly in rooms to make yourself feel important. But you don't know how systems actually work. And you certainly didn't know who I was before I retired. You ruined me. Mark shrieked, his voice rising to an hysterical pitch as he raised his phone, pointing it at me like a weapon. That was $14 million. That was my exit. I'm going to kill you, you old bastard. I'm going to. He stopped mid-sentence, far off in the distance. Cutting through the damp, heavy silence of the Redmond night came a sound, a low, wailing siren. Then another, and another. Red and blue light began to flicker faintly against the tall Douglas firs at the end of the long gravel driveway, growing brighter and closer with every passing second. Mark froze. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin a sickly grayish-white. His phone slipped from his trembling hand and shattered against the oak floor. No gasped, backing toward the basement stairs. No. He turned and bolted down the steps, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. Within seconds, the sound of metal smashing against metal echoed up through the floorboards, the frantic, violent thuds of a desperate man taking a steel hammer to his server racks in a useless, pathetic attempt to destroy evidence that had already been sitting on an FBI server in Seattle for 20 minutes. I turned back to the counter, poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, and took a slow, quiet sip. The siren wails grew deafening as 3 heavy vehicles pulled into the driveway, their high beams illuminating the kitchen windows. I set my mug down, walked to the front door, and unlocked it. The tactical entry lights cut through the Redmond rain, blinding red and blue beams sweeping across the dark bark of the Douglas firs. High-powered spotlights illuminated the gravel driveway, reflecting off the wet pavement in sharp, piercing flashes. Outside, heavy boots hit the mud in precise, synchronized rhythm. Federal agents. Warrant. Stand down. The bark of the megaphone echoed through the trees, shattering the silence of the night. Within seconds, the front porch vibrated under the weight of armored personnel. I stood in the entryway, my hands visible, resting loosely at my sides. The front door was already unlocked and resting slightly ajar. 3 SWAT operatives in full tactical gear breached the threshold, weapons raised, low-light flashlights cutting through the dim hallway. Behind them stepped 4 tactical investigators from the FBI's Cybercrime Division, wearing navy windbreakers with gold block lettering across their backs. Clear, the lead tactical operative called out, lowering his rifle slightly as his eyes swept over me. Primary residence secured. Single occupant on the main floor. A tall man with iron-gray hair, wearing a dark trench coat over an FBI tactical vest, stepped through the doorway. He carried a heavy forensic transport case in one hand. As he raised his flashlight toward my face, he paused. His eyes narrowed in recognition, and the stern, rigid posture of a federal agent suddenly relaxed into a look of profound respect. Director Vance, Special Agent Marcus Thorne said, lowering his light. Is that really you? I offered a small, weary nod. Hello, Marcus. It's been a few years. Marcus Thorne had been one of my brightest students 15 years ago when I delivered guest lectures on advanced network threat forensics at the FBI Academy in Quantico. Back then, he was an eager young analyst trying to understand how complex proxy networks operated. Today, he was the supervisory special agent heading the Pacific Northwest Cyber Task Force. When the automated alert came through our intake portal 20 minutes ago, signed, with your private cryptographic key, we thought it was a test or a system anomaly, Agent Thorne said. stepping into the foyer and shaking my hand with a firm grip. "The forensic package you sent us, David. It's the most complete digital evidence chain I've seen in 20 years on the job." Before I could answer, a violent crash echoed from the back of the house. Down in the basement, metal slammed against concrete, followed by the sound of glass shattering and a man's breathless, frantic screaming. "He's downstairs," I said quietly, gesturing toward the basement door at the end of the hall. "The daylight suite, tactical team, move in," Thorne commanded, gesturing to the 4 armed operators. The SWAT team moved down the hallway like a single, seamless machine. They kicked the basement door open, their heavy boots thundering down the wooden stairs. "Federal agents, put down the weapon. Put it down now. Don't shoot. Don't shoot." Mark's voice shrieked, hysterical and terrified. I walked slowly down the corridor, stopping at the top of the basement stairs, looking down into the brightly lit daylight suite. The room was a disaster. 2 expensive server racks lay overturned on the concrete floor, wires ripped out like severed arteries. Mark was pinned against the far wall by 2 heavy SWAT operators, his arms twisted forcefully behind his back. In the middle of the floor lay a heavy steel sledgehammer, which he had been using to smash his own hard drives in a futile attempt to destroy evidence. His designer jacket was torn, his face smeared with grease and tears. As the agent snapped steel handcuffs around his wrists, Mark spotted me standing at the top of the stairs. His eyes bulged with manic, unhinged rage. "It's him," Mark screamed, thrashing against the grip of the officers as they hauled him to his feet. "He did it. He's the Troom. He's the mastermind. Look at him. He's a former defense contractor. He set up the servers. He forged my name. He trapped me." Agent Thorne stepped down the stairs, stepping carefully over the shattered glass and twisted circuit boards. He picked up a high-density drive enclosure that Mark had failed to destroy and handed it to a forensic technician. Then Thorne turned to Mark, looking at him with cool, professional disdain. "Save it for your public defender." "Mr. Reed," Thorne said calmly, "we didn't just get an anonymous tip. We received an immutable, time-stamped forensic log capturing your hardware MAC addresses, your physical biometric keystroke dynamics, and every unencrypted session key generated from your personal device over the last 4 months." Thorne leaned in closer to Mark, pointing toward the ceiling. "Your host didn't just log your traffic, Mark. He built a full-spectrum digital sandbox around you the day you brought those servers into his home. Every dollar you stole from those veterans has already been seized and rerouted to federal recovery escrows and charitable funds by court-authorized cryptographic protocols. You didn't run an offshore empire down here. You ran a crime scene inside a trap." Mark's jaw dropped. The hysterical screaming died in his throat, replaced by a sudden, sickening silence. He looked from Agent Thorne up to where I stood in the doorway, quiet, motionless, clutching my cold mug of coffee. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The arrogant, untouchable, crypto genius collapsed into a broken, hollow shell. His knees buckled, and the 2 agents had to drag him upright as they escorted him toward the stairs. As they paraded Mark past me, he couldn't even meet my eyes. He stared at the floorboard tiles, his shoulders trembling, weeping quietly like a child caught stealing from a store shelf. I stepped back to let the agents pass. "We'll need you to sign a formal affidavit in the morning, David," Agent Thorne said as his men led Mark out into the rain. "But frankly, the work you did tonight saved thousands of elderly people from losing their life savings. It's an honor to see you're still the best in the business." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied softly. "Just make sure those veterans get their money back." "They already have." Thorne smiled, putting on his hat and walking out into the night. I walked out onto the front porch. The cool air washed over my face, carrying the clean, sharp scent of damp cedar and fresh rain. 2 tactical vans were already pulling out of the driveway. Down at the end of the gravel path, the police cruiser carrying Mark stopped briefly to wait for the road clearance. Through the back window of the cruiser, I could see Mark looking back at the house. His face was pressed against the glass, pale under the flashing blue lights. He rolled down the narrow rear window an inch and screamed out into the rain, his voice desperate and raw. "How? How could a 70-year-old fossil like you do this to me? I stood at the edge of the porch steps, the rain falling gently around me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point a finger. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee, looked him straight in the eyes through the dark glass, and delivered my answer. My voice carried through the cool, rain-washed air of the Redmond night, steady and clear. Reaching the open window of the police cruiser, you forgot one fundamental thing. Mark, long before your generation learned how to press a button, mine wrote the code. The cruiser's red taillights flickered through the Douglas firs as it accelerated down the gravel driveway, turning onto the main road and disappearing into the darkness. The wail of the fading sirens merged with the gentle rustle of the wind through the pines, until at last, the deep, pristine quiet of the forest returned to my home. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the rain filter through the high canopy of trees. The cold air settled into my lungs, crisp and pure, washing away the lingering metallic scent of hot circuit boards and cheap pomade that had polluted the air for 6 long months. Inside, the house was silent. There was no low-frequency 6-0 cycle hum vibrating through the floorboards. There was no rattle of china in the kitchen cabinets. No flickering lights from overdrawn electrical circuits. No loud, arrogant voices barking into headsets in the middle of the night. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my ceramic coffee mug, and walked down the hallway to the basement door. I descended the stairs slowly, stepping into the daylight suite. The room was littered with the wreckage of Mark's short-lived greed. Shattered plastic casings, severed fiber optic lines, and bent metal server chassis lay scattered across the polished concrete floor where the FBI technicians had cataloged and seized the primary drive units. I set my coffee mug on the workbench and began to clean. I didn't rush. I worked with the same methodical, unhurried precision that had defined every chapter of my life. I gathered the broken cables and coiled them neatly into recycling bins. I swept up the fragments of glass and plastic, clearing the floor until not a single trace of Mark's parasitic operation remained. Over the next 3 weeks, contractors arrived, not in unmarked vans at 2 in the morning, but in local hardware trucks during the bright daylight hours. They repaired the drywall, repainted the room in warm, soft tones of cream and sage green, and installed high oak bookshelves along the back wall, where noisy cooling fans had once screamed. I placed Sarah's old cedar painting easel near the tall double-pane windows. Beside it, I set up a leather armchair, a small side table, and my vintage vinyl record player. The Daylight Suite was no longer a subterranean command center for stolen fortunes. It had returned to being a place of light, reflection, and memory. On a clear Tuesday morning in early May, the sun broke through the Pacific Northwest clouds, casting golden light across the green hills of Redmond. I dressed in my dark gray wool suit, picked up a single, fresh white lily from the kitchen counter, and drove out to the quiet cemetery, nestled on the hillside overlooking Puget Sound. The grass was soft and damp beneath my boots as I walked down the familiar gravel pathway. The cemetery was peaceful, the only sound being the distant calls of gulls flying over the water and the gentle breeze rustling through the weeping willows. I stopped in front of Sarah's headstone. The granite was smooth and clean, carved with her name, and the simple inscription we had chosen together, "In quietness and in trust shall be your strength." I knelt down, resting one knee against the soft earth, and placed the white lily gently atop the stone. "It's quiet at home again, Sarah," I whispered, my voice thick with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. "The house is back to the way we built it. Mark is gone. He won't be hurting anyone ever again, and he won't ever use your memory to cover his tracks." I rested my hand against the cold stone for a moment, letting the stillness of the morning envelop me. There was no residual anger in my heart, no lingering bitterness toward the young man who had tried to destroy me. In my years, I had learned that men who build their lives on deceit, arrogance, and the exploitation of others always carry the seeds of their own destruction within them. They mistake the silence of the patient for weakness, and they confuse the quietness of age with helplessness. They never realize that true strength doesn't scream, boast, or make a spectacle of itself. True strength sits quietly in the dark, understands the terrain, and acts with absolute, decisive clarity when the moment demands it. I stood up, smoothed my lapels, and looked out across the shimmering waters of Puget Sound. The sky above was clear, vast and blue. I walked back to my car, drove home, and pulled up the long gravel driveway. I stepped into the kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, and set a vinyl record onto the turntable in the daylight suite. As the warm, rich tones of a cello filled the quiet room, I pulled up my leather chair to the window, opened my chess notebook, and began to study the board. The storm had passed, the network was secure, and the home Sarah and I had built was finally at peace. Da Huan Tang.